Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Oliver Hartwig. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. Is Sweden really a socialist economy? I mean, in our complicated world today, there are very few certainties. One of them is, of course, that all Americans are superficial, that the Russians are always drunk, and the Germans have no sense of humor. And one of these certainties is, of course, that Sweden is a socialist economy. And as we are going to hear tonight, that may not be the case. Because the left and the right in this country seem to agree that Sweden is a socialist economy, a big welfare state. But as we're going to hear tonight, maybe the left and the right are all wrong. Because Sweden has moved on from such cliches, and maybe the left and the right should move on as well. I met our speaker tonight, Dr. Christian Sandström, recently in Prague, and we met at a conference organized by the Mont Pelerin Society, and we had an interesting exchange about how we saw New Zealand, because as it turned out, Christian is very familiar with this place because he spent about 3 months earlier this year at Victoria University and studied New Zealand circumstances and fell in love not only with the country, but also with his girlfriend. And that may be the reason why he's here tonight. And when I heard about that, I said, well, you have to interrupt your holiday because I really want to find out more about the Swedish economy, because that is a story that is not too well known. We have our certain prejudices about Sweden, and we've probably heard that Sweden for a time had marginal tax rates well beyond the 100% mark, and I still wonder how that's possible. But I think this story about the Swedish success of the past few years and decades actually is something that has to be told, because there may be lessons for us here to learn, and we should really find out what the Swedes have done and which of these lessons can be adapted to New Zealand circumstances. So it's a great pleasure for me tonight to welcome Christian Sandström to the New Zealand Initiative. Christian is an economist, he has a PhD from Gothenburg, from Chalmers University, and he's currently also a think tank colleague working for a think tank in Stockholm, the Ratio. How do you pronounce it in Swedish?
Yes.
Ratio. I thought it was different in Swedish. So, great pleasure to have you here. We look forward to hearing about the not-so-socialist Swedish economy, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for that kind introduction. Yes, so this speech, as I was, we discussed whether, potential areas one could present more about. Sweden is quite often, as Oliver pointed out, brought up as sort of a poster child of something beyond capitalism and socialism. It's something in between. And I could never quite get to grips with that when I lived in Sweden, because my own economics textbooks told me central planning does not work. And at the same time, I could not deny the fact that we as Swedes, we lived reasonably good lives, didn't we? We were not living in the gutter. So how did all this relate to each other? And as you start to scratch on the surface a little bit about the history of Sweden, its economy, the policies enacted over a longer period of time, you see that there is much more to it than just this rhetoric of a middle third way. So over perhaps the coming 35 minutes or so, I will tell you this story about Sweden, actually starting with the late 19th century, moving on up until when Sweden became more socialist, and then what has happened over the last perhaps 20 years, where the country has undergone a lot of structural changes in a more free market direction. And lastly, I will point out a couple of the problems I think the Swedish economy has looking ahead. And so hopefully there are quite some exchanges we can have afterwards, given that New Zealand is in quite a few regards similar to Sweden as a small, open economy that is largely dependent on the rest of the world. And both countries have undergone significant political change over a longer period of time. So I think a good way to start this presentation is to show you where I grew up. No, that's not where I grew up. This is a typical Sweden of late 19th century. It is a very poor country. So Sweden around 1870 is poorer than Congo is today. 16-hour workday. Hundreds of thousands of Swedes left the country for the US, because starvation, poverty, there was just nothing you can do in Sweden. So that is the Sweden of the late 19th century. But what happened then was you started to introduce property rights, you removed barriers to trade, and a lot of companies were started. Most often they were based on some major product innovations. So Swedish innovations in the early 90s, they generate global companies. For instance, Ericsson is still a company around today, one of the larger employers. They introduced phones in the 1885, and Stockholm is by then the city with the most amount of phones per capita. So the reason why I'm telling you these stories about those companies is that those companies are pretty much the employers in Sweden still today, and that is a source of concern. Milk separators, introduced in the late 19th century. Maybe one or two was exported to New Zealand, who knows? Ball bearings, 1907. Company here, SKF, still one of the larger employers today in Sweden. Perhaps you've heard about the brand, SKF. This is how old the company actually is. Vacuum cleaners, 1917. Electrolux, brand you might recognize still today. Yes, it's very old companies. Now, so those are the kind of organizations which are formed in the early 20th century, and they're also the ones which are growing. And if we now take a look here, this is Swedish GDP per capita compared to GDP per capita globally and in the rest of the world. So here's 1850 and there's up to 2000. And if you're at 1, you're essentially on par with the rest of the world. So that's where Sweden is pretty much in 1850. And then by 1970, Sweden is approximately 3 times richer than the average citizen of this planet. So you see, this is an amazing story of success, where you come up to being the 4th richest country on earth in 1970. And the other graph here is if you compare Sweden to the Western world and an average of the Western world, where you can see significantly poorer in 1850 than the Western industrialized world, and then reaching approximately the same level here. And what's quite interesting here is that, yes, you know, Sweden had a social democratic government from 1936 and on. And as they described themselves historically, they enacted socialist policies. They were a working class movement from the very beginning. Now, I'll let you... This is a quote from socialist MP, and he was also minister for a while, 1918 up until 1954, saying, "Each wasted tax dollar is theft from the people." So that is the mentality of the early Swedish social democrats. You don't waste taxpayers' money, and you try to keep taxes as low as possible. I'll give you another one. This is what socialists used to sing in Sweden on the 1st of May, so, you know, International Labor Day. First, a little Swedish chorus. Både stat och lagar oss förtrycka, vi under skatter digna ner. State and law oppress us, we collapse under high taxes. Few decades later, they weren't singing that particular part of the song any longer. But this is part of the original song. So, this graph is tax revenues as share of GDP in Sweden from 1900 up until 2005. And I think is quite a remarkable graph in many regards. Number one, around 1950 here, government's share of GDP is still only around 20%, right? Number two, before that it is even lower. I mean, around 10%, and we're talking about a tax haven, right? So this is the Swedish socialist model, eh? What we see then from here and onwards is a steep increase in taxes. Up until around 1990, it sort of stays on the same level and has gone down just a little bit in more recent years. Should also add that marginal tax rates in this period here are lower than they are in the United States. So this is essentially the Swedish economy we have up until around 1970. And 1970, Sweden is the fourth richest country in the world. So here is ranking, you know, in terms of GDP per capita compared to other countries. And what has happened then, from 1970 up until early 1990s, you see quite a decline. And then it has leveled off and slowly recovered a little bit in the last 2 decades. That is the pattern, you could say, compared to the rest of the world, how competitive it has been. So now a few words about how this process of change and growth actually happened. So this is the share of Swedish population that is working in different areas. So this is in Swedish, my apologies for that. That is agriculture, industry, and services from 1870 and up until 1995. So what you have here, in those years when Sweden is growing, industry is also growing. It's becoming an industrialized country, and it is based upon those large companies, SKF, Ericsson, Alfa Laval with the milk separators, etc. So that is how Sweden is growing. And related to that, you have what is sometimes referred to as the Swedish model. Perhaps some of you think about other models than these when I say the Swedish model, I don't know. But the main idea with the Swedish model implemented in 1930s, 1940s was one of consensus where politicians, labor unions, and industry, large industrial firms, together jointly planned, discussed, reached a consensus. We're all about consensus in Sweden. We discuss until we find a consensus, and then we're very proud of that consensus. So that Swedish mentality is there, and it is gradually implemented, and this is how we plan our economy a little bit by doing this. So this is what is emerging, where labor unions benefit from having large employers, large export-oriented employers. The companies, they enjoy a lot of benefits from this. They get access to employment, they get good contacts with the politicians, and the politicians, in this case the Social Democratic Party, is very closely related to the labor union. So those two organizations are actually one organization, ruling Sweden for, I think, 40 years without any exception, up until 1976. And what happened in this time here is taxes increase. Remember the graph before, with taxes starting to increase in 1950s and on, still from very low level. What you see there starting to happen is, how do you do this? In the 1960s, you start to increase the hidden taxes. You have the total tax burden here. These green ones are the visible taxes, and these are the hidden ones, which the employer does not see. So fiscal illusion is quite big in Sweden. People think they pay 30% in taxes, whereas they actually pay much more. But most of that tax increase, which is happening in this era, is actually mostly hidden taxes. You see, the visible tax remains the same. 1960, 1970, 1980. Remains the same. And in those years, so this is after Second World War, growth rates are very high. So this is economic growth on an annual basis, 1950 up until 1971. You see, when you have many years, you have growth well above 4% for many years. 1960s, very good. And this model all works very well. So it is planned to an extent where you coordinate between large companies, labor unions, which are large, dominant, and the Social Democratic Party. And this works rather well over those years. And as the economy keeps growing, people don't mind higher taxes. But what should be added here is that this period, 1940 up until 1970, I would refer to it as growth without any structural change in the economy. What do I mean by that? That what was driving production in the economy was the same companies, the same industries in 1970 as in 1940. The average Swedish town would employ the same kind of people with the same kind of skills, the same kind of jobs. The average town, you know, in Sweden, you would have shipping industry. You had that in 1940. You had it in 1970. You would have sewing machines, radio, TV, cash registers. So these are essentially the same companies, and the industrial structure is the same. And I think partly for that reason, this model of planning, joint planning, works rather well under those conditions of stability. Then comes the 1970s, the oil crisis, and the prolonged recession, which is one of structural problems, because all those smokestack industries you had in Sweden were not competitive any longer. You had a low-cost competition from other countries, you had technological change where industries had been very stable before. All of a sudden competition sets in, and you start to have problems with all those industries. So, what Sweden did, we were supporting declining industries, the shipping industry, for instance. That's what we did in the 1970s. And if you now think of the Swedish model of consensus between labor union, large employers, and politicians, it's quite easy to reach a consensus if everything's growing, everyone's happy. Employers can have more profit, employees can have higher wages, as long as the economy is growing. Now you can see what starts to happen in the 1970s, where you have no growth for about 10 years. What happens? Labor unions are radicalized. So, Swedish once again, but this is essentially the Swedish labor union as they, towards mid-1970s, they wanted to implement policies which would effectively socialize the entire Swedish industry, would be under labor union control within 20 years with this proposal of theirs. So Sweden is radicalized in these years. Eventually what happens here is the employers start to fight back. So there is no longer a consensus here. They start to argue, and in 1983, 4th of October, this is the largest demonstration ever held in Sweden, where 100,000 people demonstrate against those attempts to socialize the economy. So, you know, this initiative to do so was stopped there, but that it is during those years, 1965 up until around 1980, where the hidden taxes are increased, where labor markets are increasingly regulated, and so the model does not work any longer. The large companies are not really competitive any longer. But Sweden holds on to this model for quite some time, and it does so by depreciating its currency. So as an example here, you have how many Swedish krona per Deutsche Mark over time. And this is from 1970 up until 2006. You can see here that there are quite a few sort of discontinuous leaps where you devaluate the currency in order to boost the export industry. So devaluations happened 1976, 1977, 1981, 1982, and those devaluations, they work quite well in the beginning because you boost the export industry. But what happens then? Unemployment comes down, but eventually what happens is inflation goes up, so your costs in terms of employers and everything else also go up, and you end up without any benefits unless you devalue it again and again and again. Eventually what happens then is that industry starts to get used to that when they have problems, they can call the Minister of Finance, he would help them out. Which means industry after a while loses its competitiveness. And that is what was happening in the 1980s, but just fueling it with these kind of policies. You can also see inflation rates. So US is blue, one here, Eurozone is gray, and Sweden is red. You can see how Swedish inflation rate is, in fact, in the 1980s here, is quite a lot higher than the US. We haven't gone into the low inflation rate era at the same time. This is really fueling an economy and a model which is not competitive any longer. So I think here we have the start of the decline here. Those devaluations where you hold on to the same model, and you see how GDP starts to, in relation to the rest of the world, starts to decline. And 1990s, the crisis here, which was triggered by an international global recession, but it was very deep in Sweden. We had negative growth for 3 years in a row, I think it was. Very deep recession. And that is also where we got to grips with ourselves and started to see that this does not work any longer. And then what happens in the early 1990s is we go from a high interest rate and high inflation economy to an economy with low interest rates. So interest rates in the 1980s are around 10%, and inflation was even higher, so you had a negative interest rate effectively. And then it starts to go into a low interest rate economy, 1990s, around there. Why that peak there? Why an interest rate of 25% in 1991, 92? We had a fixed currency, which we tried to defend by increasing the interest rates. And at some point it wasn't very sustainable, and then we let the currency float, and we have ever since. So that is one important thing, that we stop at this point to have high inflation economy. Another thing is the mindset of Swedish politicians changes in the 1980s and the 1990s towards being much more tolerant towards free market reform. I'll just give you, these are examples I'll mention briefly. Over the last 25 years, credit markets were deregulated in 1985. A voucher system for schooling was introduced in 1992. Sweden was the first Western country to deregulate the post market in 1993. The Swedish pension system was partly privatized in 1994. The electricity market was deregulated in 1996. The radio and TV monopolies were deregulated in the early 1990s. As a percentage of GDP, taxes peaked at 52.3 in 1989. In 2011, this figure had declined to 44.3%. Welfare is still primarily funded by taxes, but it is increasingly carried out by private corporations. Some 20% of employees in the sector work for companies, not for the government. Sounds like a socialist economy? Marginal taxes, as Oliver talked about, peaked at 87% in 1979, and then there were a few exceptions where you ended up above 100%. Today they are significantly lower, well, only around 50%. Still quite high. So this is what happens from the early 1990s and on, and it all starts with a deep recession, I would say, 91, 92 and onwards. Worth pointing out here is that those reforms have happened almost regardless of which political party have been in power. Almost. It's like a consensus country where everyone's moving in the same direction. Economic freedom in Sweden increases a lot in those years. There's a lot of different graphs here, but Sweden is the green one. And economic freedom, according to this index, 1994, it's around 62, goes up to 73, 74, something like that. Whereas you can see other countries like the United States and the UK declining in more recent years. So Sweden has clearly gone more in the free market direction over the last 20 years. And I think this summarizes it very well, that those indexes of economic freedom, there are a few in the world, they usually measure such parameters as size of government, legal structure, property rights, access to sound money, freedom to exchange with foreigners, regulation of credit, labor and business. And according to Swedish researchers Berg and Henriksson, in this period, Sweden only scored poorly on one dimension of economic freedom, and that is size of government. And that is pretty much where we are still today. It is size of government, but that's almost the only regard. So what has happened also in the last years? From 1994 up until 2008, public debt as share of GDP, it's around 70% in 1994 after the deep recession. Our debt is down to around 30% of GDP. You can relate that to some other European countries, if you want to. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. So, with those reforms, you can see the country sort of slowly recovering the lost ground of the 1970s and 1980s. Nevertheless, I would like to finish my part of this speech before we open up for more discussion with just pointing out a few of the challenges for the Swedish economy. So, number one, I would say still, taxes remain high in Sweden. We've had a decrease here, yes, but if you compare it to the history here, we're still by the 1960s, 1970s level. And the high taxes in Sweden, they create a couple of problems. One is declining entrepreneurship. You've seen that for quite some time, that after 1970, the establishment of new firms dropped significantly. Among the 100 firms with the highest revenues in 2004, only 2 were entrepreneurial firms founded after 1970. 2. If you then want to look at the number of employees, you take the largest employers the 100, none of those organizations have been founded after 1970. So there you can see what impact those taxes have had on the creation of new firms. And that goes back to the first slides here about the separator, about Ericsson, and those employers which are still the backbone of the Swedish economy. Related to that, Swedish economy has been very bad at creating new jobs. Job growth does not keep up with population growth. So here, blue line is population increase. Red line is public sector job growth. And green line is private sector job growth. And you see quite an obvious pattern that most of the jobs created in the 1960s and 70s was the expansion of the public sector. It's very steep, comes up here. And then it was simply not possible to create more jobs in the public sector, believe it or not.
Always possible.
But net, no new job has been created in the private sector in the last 40 years. Net. So if you have a private sector, which in terms of amount of jobs is the same size as 40 years ago, and the economy has gone from 7 million people to 9 million. You have a public sector which lives upon a private sector that is much smaller in relation to that. And that is a problem. Related to that, of course, some people work for the government, but we haven't created enough new jobs. So since the early 1990s, so 20% of the Swedish working population has been out of work. Out of work. That is, we've been fiddling around with the statistics that you're on sick leave, you have unemployment benefits, you have early retirement or something like that. There is a report on the Swedish economy by Nima Sanandaji at the Institute of Economic Affairs 2012, which I warmly recommend you to look further into. Related once again to that, you've had a decline in work ethics in Sweden for a long period of time. So in 1981 to 84, almost 82% of Swedes agreed with the following statement: claiming government benefits to which you are not entitled is never justifiable. 82% say that, 1981. 1999 till 2004, this figure had declined to 55%. That's in about 20 years, such a decrease. And you can imagine what that does to the cost of all these systems. Skyrockets. Another problem, I would say, with the Swedish economy is that wages are still set collectively, which means that the employers and the labor unions agree on wages, centrally decided. So there's labor union leader, employers union leader, and that means wages, introduction wages, are very high, which also implies that unemployment is exceptionally high among young people and ethnic minorities. Those who just can't compete on equal terms. They can only compete on price. They cannot compete. They're not allowed to compete here. Another thing related to having very high taxes is we have a lot of debt, private debt, and very little assets. So this is the debt of households compared to GDP. This is the red one. The blue one is public debt. And what you can say we have in Sweden is we have privatized debt. Right? Because we have a government debt which is much, much smaller now than 20 years ago. But private debt has gone up significantly. And related to that, when you have so high taxes, you have marginal taxes around 50%, it becomes very difficult to accumulate wealth from work. So this means that 30% of the population have zero or negative assets. No assets at all. Another 20% of the Swedish population, they have assets corresponding to 1 month's salary. It's 50% of the Swedish population. They have virtually no assets at all, no savings. So if I should conclude before opening up for questions, I try to summarize the history of my country over the last 150 years or so. Over a longer period of time, Sweden cannot be regarded really as a socialist economy. The period 1970 till 1990 was an exception in many regards. If you look back at the long history back to the 1870s and what has been done in the more recent 2 decades, this is a period of exception really. And that is what a lot of people relate to when you say Sweden. And Sweden is Swedish economics, the Swedish model, etc. But it is really only those 2 decades. Been extensive free market reforms over the last 20 years. Though still, taxes remain high and labor markets are still highly regulated. Also, Swedish economy is still designed for stability. Small companies don't grow and job creation remains low. And I think that is a big problem for the economy in the long term. So, Sweden is doing well, but much remains to be done, especially with regard to taxes and labor markets. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. We have time for questions. Who would like to ask first?
It's very interested in your school voucher program. We have some policy coming out in New Zealand at the moment that aims to be similar. I just wondered if you could comment a bit on your school voucher program, how it's doing, some of the criticisms that Sweden hasn't done as well as we might have expected in PISA over the last 20 years, what the role of profit, we'd really like to hear about that because it's becoming quite topical here.
Right. So it was implemented in the early 1990s as all elementary school and high school. Before that, what you had was you went to school depending on your geographical location, and then you went to a public school. Now what happened was you could choose which school you wanted to apply for, and they could choose whether they wanted to admit you or not. And so you have a voucher, and you're not paying. The government is paying, but you're actually the one choosing. The companies are allowed to make profits. Today, some 16% of everyone going to school, this is not for universities, it works differently, but 16% is private now in this sense. And it's partly foundations, partly it is profit driven. Regarding the outcome of this, mixed, I would say. It has created a lot more diversity in terms of teaching, how it works. It has, in some cases, raised the wages of teachers. It has created new ways of competing, and I think also they have become more operationally efficient. But it has not offset the decline in the Swedish education system, which has happened over the last 30 years. If you look at the results by international standards, in math, English, etc., Sweden has been declining steadily. It's been a sharp decline, especially in math, and the Swedish schooling system is really poor as it is now. And I would never attribute that to the voucher system, but I can just observe how it has not offset the decline. My explanation for it would be that the way education is funded, the way it is centralized, the way it is designed, the way you give grades, etc., that is still regulated by the government, and that's where you have the problems. Compared with that teacher is not an attractive job in Sweden any longer, so you don't have a lot of good people applying for or becoming teachers, and then you don't get a lot of good education either. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's very helpful.
Thank you. What sort of parliamentary system have you had? Has it changed over time? Can you see differences in party systems that are represented by the results that you've just shown us? Because we see similarities in how you are and how we are. Have you had similar parliamentary changes?
Oh, I don't know about the parliamentary changes here, but we've had a proportional system, and we used to have a two-chamber setting, which was, one chamber was removed, I think it is in the late 1960s, early 1970s, which is in this era where nobody's really questioning that, you know, the government should expand and should have more power, and we don't need to constrain it in any way. So that clearly made it a lot easier to expand or change anything you wanted to change, really. So what you have now is you have elections, general elections, for parliament, and then any political party in parliament can try to form a government. But they should arguably have a majority in parliament. But what effectively happens then is that you get a government which is majority in parliament. So you have no checks and balances between them. There is government and parliament is essentially the same body. So you have very little separation of power here, which means that it is rather easy to push the country quickly in one direction and enact changes. And I think if you look at the last 50 years, that is change in both directions.
So you don't have small parties the way we have with MMP now. You have one major party that has control and can drive the country in a direction.
It used to be the Social Democrats. I mean, they had their own majority for a little while, and they've had a coalition with the Communists and the Green Party. But you need to have 4% in order to get into Parliament. 4%. So you've had two coalitions.
What a coincidence.
New Zealand's just debating moving to a 4% threshold, so sorry.
Trying to shut down that debate.
Yes, so what has happened in the last election was that there's one party coming into parliament there which is hostile to immigration, and they got more than 4% and they are there. But this means that none of the other two coalitions have a majority in parliament. So we do have a right-wing government now, but it doesn't have a majority in parliament, and it is very constrained in what it can actually do.
I've always been fascinated by how a small country like Sweden, twice as big as us but still small, can have so many world-class companies. Now, you've taken the wind out of my sails a bit by revealing that a lot of that innovation has sort of ceased, but nonetheless, you know, you haven't even mentioned Saab or Volvo, all those other. Is there something in the Swedish DNA that produces those world-class companies? What is it? What can we learn from?
I'm also an engineer by training, so I'd like to believe that it is the ingenuity of engineers in Sweden better than German engineers, or, that makes us do so well in the global marketplace. And sure, there is an engineering culture in Sweden. I think engineers enjoy a higher status in Sweden than in other countries where we're more regarded as geeks, but also, all those decades of devaluating the currency, of supporting those large companies, of, that that's got to have had an impact on how they're able to compete in the marketplace. That you have a recession, but Swedish government supports the large companies, Volvo or Saab, a little bit more than all the others. And if you enact that kind of policy over a 50, 60-year period of time, you're going to have very large, very successful companies, yes. But it is at the cost of creation of new jobs, and it is at the cost of creating economic growth.
Just going back to the electoral system, just to clarify your answer, in New Zealand our problem is in order to govern you must hold a majority in the parliament, and therefore so in your situation where you have a party that holds the balance, they have a huge amount of power or leverage over the larger parties. Are you saying that in Sweden you don't necessarily have to have the majority of parliament, it's rather the largest voting bloc? Is that so you can only, so you including your coalition partners can say only have 40 or 45% of the seats in parliament and they still govern?
Yes.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they have but they're,
The Labour was minority government.
Yeah.
but is it just the largest voting bloc, or you must have the support of the majority or a portion of the parliament that's not voting against you? In New Zealand, to form a government, you have to have the confidence of the House. But what I interpreted your answer then was that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, you just need to be the largest. Is that?
Well, perhaps the
Am I
question is
wrong?
whether it's a parliamentary system or whether the executive is elected separate to the...
It's a
legislature.
parliamentary,
It's a parliamentary
and then
system.
the executive is formed out of parliament. And that is, I'm not entirely sure how that works. I think that's perhaps one of the few areas where the Swedish king actually has a little bit of ceremonial status or so. That combined with, it's usually quite obvious who should be in government. If there is one bloc which has more votes than the other one, then it's usually also, it makes sense for them to end up there.
But you have to find your majorities on a case-by-case basis.
Then you have to do that, and that is the problem for the current government, yes.
I just wanted to, in New Zealand and a lot of countries, people are very concerned about, the next 20, 30, 40 years where you have a demographic problem. You have a very large generation of baby boomers. I don't know if there's a big baby boom in Sweden, but we certainly have one here. And in combination with a large welfare state, that would seem to be a really big problem. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, do you have a demographic problem coming with your welfare state and what the responses are being discussed?
Yeah, we sure do, as everyone else. So, the semi-privatization of the pension system in the 1990s was a very important stepping stone in the right direction. 2, public debt is much lower and is getting lower for every year, more or less. So those are the measures I believe that have been taken. What I see as problems here, this is not enough by any means, and I would never trust the government to provide for me as I retire. That's one. Number 2, this is a certain trend we have ahead of us, but nevertheless most of this sector of the economy is not subject to competition and creation of new jobs or new companies. Still very little of it. Most of it is still run as government agencies, more or less, and that is a problem because you're not, it's an opportunity if you allow it to be an opportunity, and I don't think we do really.
Thanks for the discussion. You've got an interesting banking sector in Sweden where you've got regional banks or Scandinavian banks, at least some of them, and where we at least used to look at you and think you're like the Australians, where you sort of own the banks, and perhaps more worryingly for you, you sort of take responsibility for regulating them, even if they go wrong in Estonia or Finland or Norway. And I must say, talking to the Finns and the Norwegians was always quite interesting because they're much more like us. they sort of like you and hate you as the big brother there. But you in 1990, 91 got hit really badly compared to much of the Western downturn. And you had a very serious banking crisis in Sweden and Finland. But you didn't waste a good crisis, and you did some real tough stuff. And that's sort of written the manual for the IMF, partly because of Stefan Ingres, which is there for why aren't the Europeans doing that with current banking crisis that they've got, which is you've got to recapitalise your banks, you've got to take it tough, you've got to have austerity, you've got to do all those sort of things. Was there something about Sweden and Finland that managed to do that in 1990, 91, 92, rather than sort of papering over the cracks?
Oh,
Or was it because you were outside the EU, or rather outside the Eurozone, so you didn't sort of have Germany to bolster things?
yeah, that is true. Generally, I think that it is much easier to enact those kind of significant changes in a small and rather homogeneous country, where you can get an agreement upon doing things when you have significant problems. And that goes for...
Do you mean like Greece? Doesn't?
Greece is part of the euro. Finland, same. The Baltic countries and what they did during the recession, they cut wages 25-30% all over the country, which Greece should have needed to do. But they're just capable of doing that in a small homogeneous country where also, and this is a difference again between Sweden, Finland and Greece. In Sweden, people trust their government. We have a very high trust in our government. So do the Estonians, so do the Finnish people. We have very strong norms, very low levels of corruption. We trust our politicians to do things, and those issues of norms are easily forgotten when we think about economics, I think.
Just following on from that, do you think that high level of trust in the government that you just described is responsible for the high proportion of the GDP that the government spends?
Mm-hmm. To quite an extent. It's just more tolerable, and we're not very susceptible to sort of public choice economics, which regards them as economic beings, maximizing their own utility. We don't think about politicians like that intuitively, and I don't know, to be honest, I don't think they have been like that to the same extent as in countries in Southern Europe, where people don't trust their governments, and they haven't trusted their governments for the last 2,000 years, and they shouldn't have trusted their governments for the last 2,000 years either. You know?
You seem to have very different politicians anyway. Your current finance minister was one of the very few in the Western world actually refusing to go into stimulus in the GFC. And actually, I recently looked at your figures. It seems that even in the time of the global financial crisis over the last 5 years, the debt to GDP ratio actually declined in Sweden. How did you do that? How did you get away with it, actually?
So once again, I think in a larger economy like the euro area or in the United States, there is a much larger need to appease different interest groups, and the total cost of it is distributed over a larger population, whereas the cost is focused on a smaller population. So it's more difficult to impose those kind of policies, and in a Swedish economy that would be one part of it. Another part is being outside the euro. What happens then is that our currency depreciates as we go into recession, and that in turn fuels the Swedish industry. The export is doing pretty well. We were hit, yes, but did better because we were outside the euro area, which means that once the economy turns back again in the right direction, profits are there, industry is growing. Compared to, and this is once again about mindset, even those politicians, the Minister of Finance in 1960s and 70s, who just increased taxes every year, hidden taxes and inflation, all ways of taxation you can possibly think of, he was into, but would never, ever have an unbalanced budget. Never. Mindset. I don't know how to explain it else.
So what is Sweden's relationship with the Eurozone then? I mean, technically I think under the European treaties you are still required to join at some stage.
Yes.
Is it ever going to happen?
No. Yeah, you're right. You must join sooner or later. But there was a referendum about it in 2003. I was uncertain, and in the end I voted no. And it's in retrospect, nice. I was right about one thing in life when I was 21 years old. And ever since, it's been dead as an issue. You cannot raise it, and you cannot have a referendum. And given where things are heading now, I mean, there are more people now who want to join this party.
With more questions? Yes.
Well, I just wondered, it's interesting that there is great trust in politicians.
Yes.
We're supposed to be the least corrupt country on earth,
Yes.
you've got to fool me. But with some of the things our politicians have done. But then you also talk about a decline in ethical standards
Yes.
among the people.
Mhm.
To what do you attribute that?
Incentives to start with. So with some kind of low-paid jobs in Sweden, the difference between your net income and what you would have if you live on welfare is 10-15%. So your marginal revenue from working 40 hours per week is essentially 10 or 15% of an income. And if you have very high norms and standards and you don't believe in cheating, you won't do that. But those kind of systems are going to affect the norms of people over decades.
The other thing that you mentioned was high work ethics correlated with a very homogeneous population, very trusting society. Is that still the case, or is it changing? Because I've heard other Swedes talk about their country and they said, well, actually this homogeneity is actually on the decline, and that has an impact on the way people think about government.
Yes.
And that was one of the ways, I think, in which Sweden was very different for a long period of history from other European countries that had been exposed to migration from different cultural circles for a longer time. And I think that's changing, isn't it?
Yes. We have integration problems, and those problems... Yes, yes. And those problems are unsolved, and that is why political parties can be elected based upon
It's a Sweden
speaking,
Yeah.
based upon speaking about these problems. So it is not as homogeneous any longer. That's one. Another thing I would say is urbanization. With urbanization, we live in larger communities where we are more anonymous. As most Swedes or their parents grew up in small towns, villages where everyone knew everyone, you can't be corrupt, you can't cheat, because if you lose your reputation, you've lost everything, right? Like New Zealand in that regard, but as people increasingly live in cities, that will eventually deteriorate.
We have more questions. No more questions, and I just have to thank you for a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for telling us all about your country and everything we never knew about Sweden. And thank you for coming to the event tonight, and I'll just ask you in joining me in thanking Christian Sandström. Thank you.